there's no point in consuming all this knowledge if you don't do anything with it.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
like, yeah. So I try to think of it. I can write about it. I can apply it to my own work, and then because you're consuming so much, at some point unconsciously you start to like incorporate these ideas. We're talking about ideas that have been sort of things that I've been exposed to over 5-6 years. Like Ryan Holiday, I learned about the note card system. Tiago taught me about second brain, and then layer on top of that a book that I read called The Organized Mind, and that's how I can talk to you about this because I think about it from context of each of those three inputs and then apply it to my own life or to my own projects. So yeah.
welcome back to the Max Out Show, where today I'm joined by Srini Rao, a storyteller and host of the Unmistakable Creative podcast, where he's learned from the most creative people alive. He's the best-selling author of multiple books on reclaiming your creativity, and that's exactly what we'll talk about today. How to pursue your own definition of success and make your childhood dreams come true in adulthood. So Srini, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm super excited to have you, and I really want to start out with how your definition of success evolved over time. And so, can you take us back a couple of years and even a decade from now, and to really the beginning of your career when you're still chasing those really traditional measures of success?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is actually really interesting because I've been writing about this idea of behaviors versus outcomes, and I think like most people, I started this out with goals, and first I actually didn't start with the intention of building an audience or building a business or any of that. I started my first blog because I was trying to find a job and I wanted to stand on the job market, and this was 2009 when the job market was kind of in shambles. Uh, but kind of what's interesting is that you have this sort of one definition of what it means to be successful when you start. And for me, as a blogger with very little few readers and sort of lingering in obscurity, the definition of success was an audience and a book deal with a publisher. So a lot of people think that that's the sort of end game. But I think what ends up happening when you actually, reach that goal, there are two things that happen. One is that your goalpost for success inevitably evolves, and that's because of what's known as hedonic adaptation. So you get a book deal, and you're basically what ends up happening is your reference group changes. So prior to getting a book deal, your reference group is all people who didn't have book deals. So now you're no longer one of those people. So your basis for comparison now becomes other published authors, and instead of getting a book deal, it's, hey, New York Times bestseller, whatever it is. And that's a recipe for disaster in every way possible. But human beings are just hardwired that way. Like our goalpost will continually evolve for what it is. And so I think that part of this is that definition of what it means to be successful evolves with time for everybody. There's a point at which sort of the traditional markers, like you said, mattered, and of course those things are not unimportant. They're relevant because they open doors, they establish your credibility, and all of those things. The problem is that if your happiness and fulfillment depends on those things, that's when you get into trouble. And I think that for me, the real definition of creative success is to reach that point where you find joy in the work, but the results of your work don't determine your well-being or your happiness. As Ryan Holiday once said to me, he's like, that's just a recipe for profound disappointment because no artist knows how her audience will respond to her work. No entrepreneur can predict how a market will respond to their product. They only control their behavior, their effort, and all those things. And so part of it is detachment, I think. And again, this is really easy to say. It's hard to
Yeah.
do. Everything, and I think that that's true for any sort of life advice or whatever. It's all easy to say, hard to do, right? We all know it's like, oh, get back up when you fall, be resilient in the face of adversity. All sounds nice, but it's all easier said than done, and we don't acknowledge that because a mentor once told me, he said, when you're having a problem in your life, it's the worst thing in the world because it's happening to you. Even though somebody else may not see it that way, but it's your problem, so you see it as the worst possible thing. So I think that a definition of a success, if anything, is very personal. And if there's one thing that I have to realize, it's that you have to define that for yourself. And I think that that is harder and harder to do because we live in this world where you're inundated with podcasts, like people like me saying things like this on podcasts, and you think, oh, well, that's what it means to be successful. And it's like, no, don't listen to what I have to say. Consider it in the context of your life. This is something I say to every person that asks me for any piece of advice, is to consider the possibility that everything I'm telling you is absolute bullshit, because it might be. In the context of your life, my advice might be nonsense, and that's something that nobody talks about. Like, people overlook that because you say, oh, well, this person is an authority figure, this person has, accomplished something I want to accomplish, so if I do exactly what they say, then I'll get the result that they have. And that's not true, because you're not them.
Yeah, I
Which
love
is
that.
a
You
long
talk
way
a
of
lot about
answering the
also
question.
really finding your own path, right? Instead of becoming the best, really becoming the only. So how
Yeah.
does that play into it?
I mean, again, like, I think that the funny thing is, we like this idea of sort of how tos and roadmaps and
Mm.
formulas for, okay, follow these, 6 steps, and then you'll become unmistakable. And I think that that is one thing I realized about, even writing the first book, was that there is no formula, which is largely what the book was about. Is the fact that, if you keep just looking to what other people are telling you for this, then you can't really come up with anything original, or tend to trust your own instincts. So it comes through. But if we're going to get tactically, or I'll kind of walk you through sort of tactically how you might actually go about doing this, while also knowing that nothing here is set in stone, that you have to be willing to adapt and modify everything I say to fit the context of your life. And so a big part of it starts with experimentation, right? Because we don't really know how, like I said, an audience will respond. We don't even know what we're good at 90% of the time. In a million years, the funny story, when people would ask me what I was going to do after business school, I would tell them, I know one thing: it'll have nothing to do with the internet. And which is insane, considering what I do for a living. But we have no sense of what we're good at. And so often people will follow trends and say, oh, some online marketer says everybody should start a podcast, so now there are a million podcasts in iTunes, and most of them aren't that good, because a lot of people didn't do it because they really wanted to. They did it because, of FOMO. It's like, oh, I'm missing out on this bandwagon. So that's the first thing I would say is, get clear on the reasons why you're doing something, and go try it before you commit to it. This is another thing, because, you know, one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was from a woman named Tina Seelig, who's a professor at Stanford. And, this whole idea of follow your passion, right, is something that people talk about constantly, and it's bullshit. It's nonsense. It's literally the worst advice out there for your career. Because if people did that, right, Dan Kennedy has this great quote about passion. And he says, I'm passionate about lying in a hammock, eating pizza, and betting on horses. He says, my passion could multiply for those things, and nobody would pay me to do them. And Tina Seelig made a good point. She said passion follows engagement. And so I think that part of this is trying different things, seeing what you find engaging. And then once you discover what you find engaging, it's about putting in the time and effort to take that from something that you find engaging to something that you're actually good at, to then something that you become masterful at. And that's a lengthy process. If you ever read any of Robert Greene's work, mastery is 10, 15, 20 years in the making, and it doesn't end. That's the thing. Mastery is a lifelong process. You don't ever just say, oh, I'm done, I'm the best in the world at this, I'm an expert. Like, that would be like LeBron saying, hey, I don't need to shoot free throws anymore, or I don't need to go to the court anymore, because now I've won an NBA championship, so it's safe to say that every time I get on the court, I'll win a championship. That's not true. He has to basically maintain and do the things that have gotten him to where he's at. um, but then the other thing is to look at point of view, right? Justine Musk had a really good way of putting this. And she said, if you have a bold and compelling point of view, it'll piss people off. And a lot of people hate that idea because they're so afraid of rocking the boat, and so afraid of, provoking people and making them angry. And the thing is that if anything is emotionally resonant, it's inevitably going to be polarizing. You look at Mark Manson's book, the Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, right? There are probably a lot of people who hate that book
Oh
simply
yeah.
because the word fuck is in the title. And he's offended those people, which is fine. If you're not offending somebody, then you're doing something wrong. And, I think that I've seen two extremes with my work. One has been, this is a gift to the world. The other is, this is a disservice to humanity. You talk about polar opposites.
Wow, yeah.
And I'm okay with that, because the people who say it's a disservice to humanity, I'm like, great, we're not for you. There's 1,000 other shows you could listen to. There's 1,000 other podcasts you could subscribe to. I'm not for you. And you have to be okay with that. So that's a big part of this, is, being willing to say, I'm not for you. But then point of view, I think, is really one of those things that's missing from, people's work. And if you don't have a point of view, it's hard to stand out if you're just echoing and parroting the same bullshit that you hear on, a thousand different shows. Like podcasters are notorious for this, where you'll often see it's the same guests on the same show saying the same thing a thousand times. And, it's not really, what's sad about that is that they're stuck in an echo chamber. So they're not actually exposing themselves to new ideas, which takes me to another point. The more that you can expose yourself to in terms of ideas, insights, and a diversity, right? Because one thing I saw, and I saw this in my own behavior, was when I first started this, my tendency was to primarily read books about online marketing, blogging, and all that stuff that people tend to do when they start these kinds of things. And then I remember talking to Julian Smith, who had one of the most popular blogs on the internet. And the thing that struck me most about what he said was that he didn't read blogs. Here's a guy with the
Wow.
most popular blog on the internet who doesn't read blogs. And he said, and I only read books and I don't read the books that other people read. And so if you expand, sort of the input that you're taking in and make it more diverse, you get sort of this rich ecosystem. Robert Greene once told me that the analogy is biodiversity, where, the more species you have in an ecosystem, the richer that ecosystem becomes. And I think the same thing is true for your input and your media consumption and the knowledge that you're building, because then you're going to have multiple data points to draw from. Like on one week I'll be reading about politics, the next, economics. And if you look at Ryan Holiday's newsletter, the one that he sends out with his monthly reading list, one of the things that's interesting is the diversity of books that he reads. And if you read Ryan's books, it's very clear that he's drawing examples from multiple viewpoints. He can go back 200-300 years, find some historical example, then find some modern day example, and then tie it to a lesson about the obstacle is the way. And that's because I think he exposes himself to a diversity of ideas. And that's what I think is lacking often when people are trying to figure out how to stand out, is they're just exposing themselves to the same types of books, the same types of people, going to the same bullshit seminars. And then they're like, why is my work not interesting? It's because you basically are hearing the same thing, consuming the same thing, and then just echoing it. This is why, I jokingly say that my first book, Unmistakable, could have got just as easily been called Everybody is Full of Shit. Uh, you know, and so that I think is really, if we're going to get tactical, that's the closest thing to tactical I could offer. And again, I think you'd be an idiot to follow this advice to the letter. I think you should question it and be skeptical about what I'm telling you, because it might not work.
Yeah, I love this, and I mean, there's so much great stuff already that I really want to unpack a little bit. And first of all, I want to go back to this passion myth, because I absolutely agree, right? That lying in the hammock, right? If that's your big passion, right, or eating a bunch of junk food or playing video games, it's probably not going to do much of a service to the world. And
Yeah.
so what? How much of an aspect does this sort of intrinsic joy or this ability to get
Um,
into flow really play then, when we're
so
sort of seeking out
you
our zone of genius?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, right? You mentioned the word service to the world. And so if you look at people who manage to turn their passion into something that allows them to make money, it's actually not about them. It's about other people and how they help other people. If you look at even anything in Ramit's copywriting course material, or even go to his, website Growth Lab, every piece of advice about copywriting centers around shift the focus from you to your audience. And this is kind of an interesting, paradox, because I've written a book called Audience of One. So I think that the balancing act is that you have to be excited enough about this thing that, because if you're not excited about it, then it's a tall order to think that anybody else will be.
Yeah.
So when you are going through if you're just going through the motions because somebody else said you should do it, or you think it's going to lead somewhere, then that's going to come through in the work. Like, it will just be very obvious that you didn't care about this. And that's, one of those things where you got to think about. Now, the other thing we have to think about here is skill, right? Just because you're passionate about something, even if there's a market for it, if you have no skill for it or no aptitude for it, then you're going to have a hard time with that. People often will do things that they're terrible at because they think there's a market for it. So let's just use podcasts as an example. And I've written about this somewhere before, where, some really amazing, talented, but incredibly introverted artist who can't stand speaking to people says, oh, you know what, I'm going to start a podcast. And then it turns out that she's actually horrible behind the microphone. And now, instead of being an extraordinary artist, she's an average at two things instead of extraordinary at one. And so that's another thing to think about is do I have any natural aptitude for this? Now, look, I'm not saying that your skills are set in stone. Anybody can learn how to do something and get better at it, but you also have to think about the probability that you're going to succeed at that. So my old mentor Greg really had this great distinction between probability and possibility, where he used the examples like, is it probable that you and I could go to the Olympics? Or, for the one I always come back to, is it possible that I could play NBA basketball? Yeah. Is it probable? Fuck no. I'm a scrawny Indian person. Like LeBron James probably wouldn't even like stand next to me in a game of street ball. So that's the other thing that we don't look at here is context and probability really matter. Uh, I had a lot of advantages that a lot of people don't have and couldn't replicate. I had an amazing mentor who just happened to take me on, who I connected with on Twitter. Um, I had a 10-year head start on something that's become a massive cultural trend, which are podcasts. I was raised by Indian parents who instilled rigid discipline. Like those things matter, and people hate the idea that all those things matter because those are factors that you can't replicate. Uh, but the thing that you can replicate is the behavior, and you can replicate, the willingness to put in the work. But you don't want to overlook those kinds of things that really could determine, because otherwise you're going to spend years on something that is actually going to lead nowhere without being honest with yourself about what you're good at and what you're not. Look, I'm an average writer at best, and the only reason I write anything worth reading is because I write a lot. Yeah, I've gotten to
Wow.
publish books and publisher, but I'm not James Clear, I'm not Mark Manson. Like those guys are far better writers than I am. Clearly, all you have to do is look at the book sales. And for me, I know that I'm far better at interviewing than I am at writing because the numbers speak for themselves. Uh, so it's kind of knowing, what it is that you really have the potential to be great at, is really what I would look at, rather than just saying, okay, passion. And then I'll sum this up with one final example about, businesses and passion need to be market driven. So Sonia Simone from Copy Blogger calls this the naked mole rat problem, right? And there are people who have interest in all sorts of weird shit. And yeah, there's a truth to the fact that no matter what you're interested in, even if it's underwater basket weaving or killing an endangered species, there's probably a community for that. Not that you should kill an endangered species, but I was thinking about the movie Basketball, where there's a scene where some kid who's the Make a Wish Foundation he's a sick kid, and Trey Parker and Matt Stone walk in and they're like, "What's your dying wish?" And he's like, "I'd like to kill an endangered species, like a bald eagle," which is hilarious. But but the point being, there are communities for just about everything, but that doesn't mean that those passions can be monetized, right? So Sonia someone calls this the naked mole rat problem. So if you have a passion for naked mole rats, you could start a blog about it, you could create an online course about it. Your ceiling on that is always going to be limited because the number of people who give a shit about mole rats is pretty limited.
Yeah.
Um, so that's these are sort of contexts to think about when you're thinking about this whole passion idea.
Yeah, so how do you feel about this naked mole rat life, really, right? Or the sort of the starving artist that's doing what he loves, but isn't really getting sort of the financial rewards, the attention, and all of that. Do you feel like
Yeah,
also in your life, right? If you're doing this podcast, but nobody really cared, would it still be worth it to you?
that's a hard. So the thing is, it's easy. Like I said, it's really easy for me to like dish whatever bullshit I have to say here because I'm not in that position anymore,
Yeah.
right? So again, like consider the context from which I'm giving this advice as somebody who has spent 10 years building this thing that's doing relatively well, that I'm making a living off of it. So it's really hard to say. I think that really comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning is if this is solely the reason that you're doing it, then you're already kind of doomed from the start, because even the best artists in the world, everybody starts with zero readers on their blog. Every business starts with zero customers, and if you don't actually enjoy the process of doing this thing, then really what's the point? And so you're bringing up a good point, though, because people think probably our audience is far bigger than it is. We've been around longer than almost every podcast out there. Like we're one of the first interview-based podcasts, but our audience has grown slower and it's smaller than a lot of the people who came after us. And I had to come to terms with that at some point. But I realized where it started to become really rewarding was when I started focusing on the craft. The other thing to think about when you look at these projects that appear to be leading nowhere is what are the sort of positive externalities that come from them, which is a concept from economics, which are sort of unintended benefits of some action. So, stupid example, when I was studying for an economics midterm in college, there was a girl in my class who was really hot. And so I would study with her. And I was like, the positive externality of this stupid class is that I get to study with this hot girl. So that's just in case you don't know what the terminology. But so there are going to be sort of spillover benefits from doing this, even if it appears to lead nowhere in terms of the outcome that you're seeking. So I'll give you an example. I wrote two books with a publisher. I've not sold enough books or had an idea that's appealing enough to warrant a book contract for a third book. But you could just say, "Oh, great. Well, if I don't get to write books for the rest of my life, what was the point to that?" Because that's ideally what you want, and that's kind of overlooking all the other benefits that came from it. And one of the most invaluable skills that came from writing two books with a publisher was that I can take a vague idea and I can stick with a project long term and I can bring it to life. And I can take that and I can apply it to just about anything. I could go and start a business, in an industry I knew nothing about, and take that concept of what I learned from writing books and organize ideas and structure, projects and execute because of what I learned from that process. So I think that that's the thing you want to consider when you think about this idea of sort of the starving artist or maybe things really nowhere. Now let's talk about the starving artist mindset. Jeff Goins wrote this amazing book called Real Artists Don't Starve, and I've been seeing this in my community lately as we've been encouraging people in our online program to raise their prices by 20, 30, 40, 50%, and they're all kind of resistant to it at first, and then they're kind of shocked when people pay. So I think artists have some sort of stupid, sort of guilt about charging for their work. They feel like they're doing wrong. It's like, oh, I'm selling out. And it's like, okay, great. Do you want to sell out or do you want to be a starving artist? That's the choice you're making. And you're not selling out because you starving yourself to death to, serve your audience is actually a disservice to both you and them, because at some point you're going to stop making that art and start making really crappy art because you're worried about how to survive. And so I think first you got to get over this idea that there's something wrong with being paid for your work. And that's a big one. That's a huge hurdle for people to overcome. But the way that I think to best sum that up, as was something one of my podcast guests told me, she said, "You're always getting paid, and you're always getting paid in the currency that you're asking for. And most people are asking for likes on Facebook and likes on Instagram. I like to ask for money. Money is a lot more useful than stupid vanity metrics. Last I checked, my landlord isn't accepting likes and hearts for rent, and I'm guessing nobody else's is either. So that's something to give some thought to. Is okay, like what is it about charging for my work that feels off? Like why? Is it up to? Do I feel like it's not of